Hi there, IPEG. This is Rod Gerardo, research resident at Cincinnati Children's, and I'm very excited today to help walk you through the history of IPEG, the International Pediatric Endosurgery Group. And to do that, we have to tell a story about innovation and an innovator, an absolute legend in the pediatric surgery world, Dr. Keith Georgeson. So without further ado, here's a little discussion between my boss, Todd Ponsky, and Dr. Georgeson. Enjoy.
Take us back. So Keith, how did IPEG start?
To tell this story right, we have to go back to 1988.
I had been developing in my lab an artificial anorectal valve for fecal control for patients that had anorectal malformations. And my funding suddenly dried up in 1988.
So by 1989, Dr. Georgeson's funding is all but dried up. He needs to find investors, and then he sees a flyer for an IPEG event in Berlin in 1989, in November. Do you understand what I'm saying here?
I was trying to go to sleep one night, and all of a sudden I heard this just terrible noise outside. I mean, it was like thousands of people. It turned out to be millions of people on the main street of West Berlin. And they had just opened the gates and these folks had streamed over.
These initial meetings were really small and they really just talked about endoscopy and pediatrics.
The three first meetings were really not anything like IPEG. They were about flexible endoscopy and rigid endoscopy primarily, and things related to that. And thought, well, I'll go over to Germany and I'll present the lap pull-through, which I had not presented to pediatric surgeons up until then. So I went over, presented the paper, and I met Professor Willitall, who was sponsoring the meeting, and then the guy that was doing all the legwork was Jürgen Sleeve.
After meeting that group of pediatric surgeons, he then gets invited to a meeting.
All they wanted to know was what was the future of pediatric endosurgery.
Gradually, the conversation then turns to a mutual frustration between these pediatric surgeons.
And we got to talking about how difficult it was to make any advances because we couldn't really present to a friendly audience. And so the idea came up, well, let's form some kind of a committee that has a meeting every year and it'll be international. And so I volunteered to sponsor the meeting.
So the group settles on 1995 and they settle on a location, Orlando, Florida.
So we advertised in a bunch of different surgical journals. And we didn't know what we would get, but the abstracts started coming in. We didn't have an abstract committee. I reviewed them all.
So Dr. Georgeson wasn't there for the founding of IPEG necessarily, but he's definitely a big part of this transition from an endoscopy group to a surgical group.
Well, it was right at the flexion point of minimally invasive surgery in general. But in pediatric surgery, we didn't take out many gallbladders in those days. So we had to broaden what we could do. And that's when we needed everybody to contribute.
So there you have it. The history of this pediatric surgical group founded at a time and place where literal walls were being broken down around them by true innovators. And how exactly do you define innovation? Well, here's what Dr. Georgeson thinks.
When you can do that, in fact, a lot of innovation is that. You have one thing you do well and another thing seemingly unrelated, put those together, and it makes lightning.
I think you're right. Two different worlds that come together creates innovation. So